Hi, everyone. Welcome to Turning Point. I'm your host, Blaine Bursch, co-founder and CEO at Dryrun. And I'm really excited today to have joining me Wally Vogel, CEO at SparcPay. And I met Wally not too long ago. We were both part of an Intuit accelerator, and we had a really terrific experience, not only in the accelerator and dealing with Intuit, but especially meeting other entrepreneurs. And it's so I'm really excited to have you on today, Wally. It's been a little while since we got to chat.
Absolutely, Blaine. Thanks for having me on, and I'm looking forward to catching up.
Yeah, for sure. And, and some of the things that this will make it a kind of fun for me too, because I don't know a lot of your background before you started to roll out SparcPay. So that's where I'd like to begin. Like, where did you get started and how did that roll into your entrepreneurial journey?
Sure. So I guess I was fortunate that I started right out of school. I got hired in an off-campus or on-campus interview right into a company that was doing payment processing. So I really got my introduction into an industry that I've stayed in through my career. And so over the first few years of my career, I worked in various roles for various companies. And then at one point, my wife and I said, you know what, it's time. We always said at some point we'd like to start our own company. I said, you know what, I think it's time. So that's what we did. So I left a nice, well-paying job with with a company that had where I had lots of employees and global customers, and started on my own from this office. The office has been remodeled since, but started on just myself and a computer and a phone to start a company that became Creditron.
Nice. And that's a familiar experience for me. Like, I'm in a different room now, but that was when I started my first business back in '99. It was the exact same thing. It's like I went and got a cheap desk at a discount place, and I had a laptop and a phone, and that was kind of how we got going. It's very familiar.
That's where most of us start. Absolutely.
Yeah. So Creditron, you call it. So what was the idea behind Creditron? What was the sort of the problem you're trying to solve there?
Yeah, so Creditron really was about solving the problem. I always said when I was at Creditron, you want to be my customer, because if you're my customer, the biggest problem you have is the amount of money coming in every day. So,
Nice.
So what Creditron did is we helped organizations, primarily large organizations, government, insurance companies, banks, and so forth, that were getting hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, up to hundreds of thousands of checks a day in through the mail. So they would have a mail room that literally had buckets and buckets and buckets of mail that were filled with paper checks. And what we did is we helped them with our software, but we also paired up or teamed up with some hardware organizations that had automated mail opening and scanning equipment. So literally now in the mail room, the buckets of mail came in, you just throw them onto a machine and it would open and scan them, and our software would figure out what was on them and which accounts to post them to and deal with the exceptions, and then get it all posted into your accounting system and deposited to the bank electronically and digitally. So you would literally truncate the paper in the mailroom. So that's what, I mean, we didn't kind of start with that, but that's our solution was always about converting paper checks to digital images and transactions.
Yeah.
And obviously we started smaller, but eventually we got up to that scale where we had clients doing hundreds of thousands a day in some pretty major operations, like Transamerica, for example.
Yeah. Oh, it's fascinating for me to, first of all, I didn't know that there's machines. I never thought about it, that actually would open the envelope, take it out, scan it. Like, that's really, it's like, that's a robot. that's pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's very cool. So with Creditron, how, like, I guess I want to go back to when you had just that computer and that phone.
Yeah.
How did you, like, because you said this is where we fast forwarded to, this is where we got to, but how did you get started there? Like, did you have a way into that first client, or what could you offer that first client where they would say, yeah, that's gonna help me. That makes a lot more sense than us doing this manually or whatever.
Yeah. So for me, it actually came. So I was studying in the evening for my MBA. And somebody in my study group was with a company called NCR, which is big, or at that time was big into all kinds of financial equipment. They still do, I think, automated teller machines and point of sale and so forth. So anyway, there was this fellow from NCR, and he said, listen, we've got a problem, and I think you could help us out with it. And I said, well, you know what? If I come to help you out with that, I'm going to be competing with the company I'm working with, which means I would have to quit my job. But guess what? I'm ready to quit my job. Would you give me a distributor, if I helped you out with this problem, would you give me a distributorship for this little check scanner that they had just introduced? And this was like, people are now familiar with, mobile phone capture, right? You get a check, you snap a picture on your phone. That was a very, very distant dream back then. At that time, to have a tabletop machine that could scan a check and get a digital image was magic. And I was able, just through that connection, I was able to get the distributorship in Canada initially only for that scanner. So that was really where, as soon as I had the signed distribution agreement, I ordered some scanners, started writing some software on that computer, started making some calls on that phone. First customer, I think, was a local electric company that I knew was getting a lot of checks and were looking to improve. They had one of those change agents there, somebody that was ready to be a champion and to sort of upset the status quo to get more efficient. So they became our very first client, and then we just went from there. Kept writing the code, making the phone calls, ordering more scanners from NCR, and off we went. So I think when we started, I think we were actually the 4th distributor in Canada for that particular scanner. Within a year, we were the leading distributor, and within 2 years, we were the only distributor because the others exited the business. They went on to other things. They did fine, but they stopped that. And that's when we said, okay, now we got Canada, now let's expand to the US. And that's when we expanded into the US, and that's when things really took off.
It's an interesting story, because I've seen this with a lot of entrepreneurs, and when people are, you talk with people that sometimes aspire to be entrepreneurs, but they have that day job. And that is so often the story is it's not people sort of leave and they got just like nothing. They've got something cooking. They've got they've got a deal. They got this. They've got a client. They got something that helps them make that transition, because you can't just leave and kind of just wait by the phone, right? Like, you have to have some sort of activity, and that's what you sort of described. That's a very sort of how you did it a little different, but it's a very common approach is stepping out when you kind of got a deal in place. You see that opportunity, but you've got a vehicle to start with. You don't just have to leap.
Yeah, I think every entrepreneur starts with a vision or an idea, right? But then it's a question of, how do you execute? And if you want to execute, you have to find that early traction. And you're right. Like, if you leave without having any idea where the early traction is going to come from, it's going to be a very tough slog. Whereas if you say, okay, I'm leaving my steady job, but I know that there's this opportunity here, and I know it can be filled with this, and you can, you're not there, but you can see how you're going to connect the dots pretty quickly. And I think that's important.
It's so interesting, because a lot of times when I see sort of budding entrepreneurs fail early, it's because they usually focus on almost like the internal part of their business first. It's like, well, I'm going to buy a computer, I'm going to set up my office, I'm going to do all of this. The ones I find are successful are the ones that I'm going to find a client and they'll figure the rest out. And because it's that understanding that, like, nothing happens without having some clients, without having sales, without having some way to bridge that gap and actually get some sort of momentum going.
Exactly.
Now, you talked about this, kind of interesting, because you talked about, like, starting, quite small, and then taking those little steps up and little step up, and then getting more and more, and then expanding into the States. And that was a real sort of fundamental point for you. How did you, you sort of tackled Canada, but now if you're going to another market, I'm thinking back then it was a little different than now. It's like, now I'm like that everyone buys from us across the globe kind of thing. Then it was, you actually had to enter that market. How did you, what sort of opportunities, and how did you smooth that out so you could actually enter that market successfully?
So we entered pretty. So I remember that our entree into the U.S. market. We went to a trade show conference in Boston. My wife and I went, and she was my marketing vice president, and I was the CEO. And we had a little tabletop display. I was really lucky, because usually you have to spend a few $1,000s on a booth. Well, they had these little tabletop displays that you could rent for whatever, $800 or something like that. I found out afterwards, because Boston was a union town, you had to pay somebody $500 to carry your monitor over to your $800 table. But that's another story. You live and you learn about these things, right? So that was our entree. And I remember, I won't name the company, but I remember we had our little tabletop display, and there we are going, here we are, US, we're the answer to all your problems. And right across from us was the first version of that machine that you were referring to as a robot. Back then, it was huge. It was massive. It was probably like 30 feet long and 10 feet high, and it was in the booth of the biggest company in the U.S. that was doing something similar to us. And we just stood there, and we had our little tabletop. They had a 2-story thing with this big machine and meeting rooms on the second floor and everything else. And I just stood there and went, okay, you know how we're going to do? We're going to do this one customer at a time. We're going to find a customer that went to that company and they said, you're too small, or you're looking for something too special, or whatever. That the big company, you can't please everybody. No matter how big you are, you can't please everybody. So we'll find the prospects that the big company's not pleasing, and we'll make sure that we do everything we need to get them what they need. And that's really how we started. And it grew, frankly, quite quickly. But to your point, though, it wasn't a globalization, it wasn't as global back then. And I think that comes and goes to some extent too. But we definitely had to, in order to get that growth in the US, we definitely had to have resellers and employees in the US that were selling to it wasn't about sort of calling from Toronto to selling to Texas. You can do a bit of that, but if you really want to, and particularly because we're dealing with government, right? And they want to buy from a domestic partner. So that's the way we did it. We just went with the customers that the big company couldn't handle or didn't want to handle, and start with them. And then, again, fast forward many years later, after we'd been acquired and done some acquisitions, and we were a subsidiary of a public company, I went to the same trade show in California many years later, and we had the bigger booth. They were
nice.
It's still, we didn't have the whole 2-story thing, but yeah. So it was just sort of an indication to me of that was the arc of my journey with Creditron, was starting very small and then getting to that point and saying, okay, now we're here. Now I have to go do something else.
Yeah. It's I think there's a couple things that I kind of want to dig into a little bit there. And one is it's interesting because just basically you described there, and for entrepreneurs, we always hear about your go-to-market strategy. And the go-to-market strategy is exactly what you said, is we're not going to compete directly with those guys. We're going to find our niche. We're going to find that opportunity that is underserved, and we're going to go after that. And it takes a lot of sort of seeing that opportunity, but it also takes a lot of discipline to identify that and go after that, rather than early on. A lot of times with entrepreneurs, it's like, well, anyone can be our customer, and it's like, and you're trying to figure out who that is. And the more you get into that niche and you go, that is exactly, here's the opportunity, and you tackle that, that's where you get that flywheel going. That's where you get the engine going, right?
Well, exactly. I think anybody can be our customer is a really dangerous approach, because
it is,
because you'll probably find people that will take up your time, but they may not really have the pain that you can solve that they're willing to pay for. Right. And that's the magic combination. Like, do they have a pain? Can you solve it? And are they willing to pay for it? If those 3 things aren't there, then you're just spending time.
Yeah, that's exactly. And you find out the hard way. You find out when it's like, I spent a lot of time and how many meetings, and it's like just went flat, right? And it's interesting too, because you were looking for the sort of underserved, initial group, but then you started saying that, you mentioned that you had to find some of those bigger clients, and you sold into government, and I know that pain, because my last business, I had it for over a decade, and 70% of our revenue came from government contracts. So I know the good parts of it, but I know the pain of it as well, in the sales process and everything that goes along with it, and the boilerplate contracts and all the stakeholders. Every time I hear the word stakeholder, the hair on the back of my neck stands up. I'm like, oh no, this bloody deputy minister is going to be a pain in the ass, right? Like, just, you knew it was coming, right? What were some of the tactics or strategies that you used to actually go into a big organization like that and find your way through to someone that actually is going to be a champion for you and buy from you?
Yeah, so this is where I'm going to loop right back to, I mentioned that I started with this distributorship from NCR.
Mm-hmm.
And initially, our first distributorship on it said, okay, you can have a distributorship on this scanner, but you can't sell it to the banks, you can't sell it to the government, and you can't sell it to insurance companies. Right? Because at the time, NCR had a direct sales force to sell to those big prospects, right?
Yeah.
So that's fine. Again, it's exactly what I say, look for the underserviced market. So I went for that's fine. There was an electric company that wasn't on the list of exclusion, so I went after them. But then what happened, interestingly enough, those sales reps at NCR that, we were supposed to be locked out of those accounts because they were handling them directly, but they heard about some of the success we were having, maybe through a little bit of promotion from us. They found out about the success we were having, and they started saying, well, why don't you help me with this? And why do you help me with that? And we literally got I think, like, within our first year, we had the government of a department of the government of Canada on as a customer. We had to go through an RFP process that was fun, but we won it.
Also makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up when you say RFP. So.
Oh yeah. So they were probably the first ones we engaged with, but they weren't the first ones to close because of the RFP process. But the other one was, they said, oh, can you help me out with this account? And I said, sure. Who is it? They said CIBC. I'm like, okay. So we actually put the first check imaging system into CIBC. And so, how did we get into the big accounts? We got in by kind of walking in beside a big player that, that had the gravitas to go to the exec level at CIBC and say, here's somebody that has a solution, have a look at it. Right. Yeah. So it really was through strategic partnerships. It wasn't through me knocking on the door saying, hey, can I talk to you? Can I talk to you? That's a really tough slog. Whereas if somebody can take you straight to the person at the exec level that has the pain and say, hi, you've got a pain, here's somebody that can cure it. That's how you get into the big accounts. Yeah.
And it's interesting because to me, because that's what, like, my previous history, that was basically all we did was we were selling to like government and big accounts. And it just, after the first year or two of serving small business, you're just like, we can't do it on this. And you start going bigger and bigger and bigger. And what it comes down to, we always said, like, all of those sales, it was all relationships. And really what it was that networking, but it was nurturing those relationships and then getting those introductions and being the one they think of, like staying up with them enough that when they have that problem, they think of you. Or you just happen to phone them, like, once every month or two, and also like, we actually have an issue. Like, we got an RFP that's coming out. So, and it was all about relationships and maintaining those relationships. And boy, sometimes it could be years before you would get from first conversation or to actually a close, right? But you have to nurture those. Unfortunately, then there'd be some that would be fairly quick and it would kind of balance out. But it's even today with the Zoom world, relationships are how business is done, right? As people are doing business with people. Absolutely. Most of the time.
Absolutely. And I think it's building relationships that are based on mutual respect and trust, right? Because that trust is so important, right? Like, you can meet somebody at a trade show or whatever, but it's when they get to know you over time and they know that, what, if Blaine says he'll do A, he'll do A. Right. And if he says he'll do B, he'll do B. And so when he says he'll do C, I trust him and I know he will. Right. And I think it's about building that trust, because, anybody can come into a boardroom and do a pitch and say, we'll do this and this and this. Right. but
Yeah.
can they actually deliver is always the question that's going to be in the back of the mind of the decision maker. And that's where that relationship and trust built over time is what, and obviously you have to deliver then, right? Which is not, we several times at different scales of the company, we won big deals that just about killed the company, right? Trying to deliver, right? Because we made, and one of them, ties into the mission of Dryrun in terms of cash flow. Can I tell a little story around that?
Love to hear it. Yeah.
So our first six-figure contract. So we moved into an office. We had a couple of employees. We got our first six-figure deal through an RFP with the federal government, and we're blown away. We're excited. It was whatever. It was $500,000 deal. And with $100,000 deposit, which is great, right? So we're like, okay, this is great, yay! We're all celebrating, and then, but in the meantime, I'm paying office rent, I'm paying employees, and so on and so forth. And that $100,000 deposit check hasn't shown up yet.
Yes,
and it still didn't show up, and it still didn't show up. And I remember the day I'm driving in my car. I just met with a customer. I'm driving back to the office, and the phone rings. And it's my banker, and he says, "Wally." I said, "Yeah." He says, "You just wrote a check to NCR." I said, "Yeah." He says, "I can't clear it because your source deductions just came out of the account, and I can't clear this check." He says, "I can hold on to it like till the end of today, and that's it. Then I'll have to bounce it." I'm like, if you bounce that check, then NCR is going to stop shipping hard. The whole the dominoes fall. Right?
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, I'm going to be back in the office in a minute. Hopefully the check's going to be there, right? Because they promised it. So anyway, I went back to the office. My wife was there. I said, "Listen, you're my good luck charm. Come down," because the mail room was down in the basement, right? Come in the elevator. We'll go down and get the mail. So we went down. Sure enough, take out the mail. There's a check from an envelope from the government of Canada, right? So we get back on the elevator. I said, "Open it up." She opens it up. It's a check for $100,000, right? We're saved.
Yeah.
We're so excited. We jump up and down going, "Yay, we did it. We did it." The elevator stops from the jumping. No. We triggered the sensor in the elevator. Now I'm picturing, okay, we're going to be stuck in this elevator with the check.
With the check.
The banker's going to bounce. Anyway, fortunately, the elevator was reset. We got the check to the bank. Everything was fine. I learned an important lesson about planning further ahead than that.
Yeah.
And after that, anytime that there was a big check coming in, the inside joke was, "Well, how big is it? An elevator breaker?"
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. It's, man, and for there's not as many checks sent today. So I don't know if a lot of business people have that same feeling, but we used to call it like the lonely walk to the mailbox.
Yeah.
And man, I can picture the hallway all the way up to the mailbox, the key, because you'd be just like, "Where is this bloody check? Where is this bloody check? Where is this bloody check?" And you're talking with them. "No, it's in the mail." "Are you sure?" We even had trouble one time. I remember when our mail carrier was off on, I found all this later, but they were off on vacation or something like that. They had somebody fill in. The mail basically just like disappeared. So I'm actually on the phone with the supervisor for Canada Post in that area going like, "We get mail every day. We haven't got mail in 3 days. And I've got these checks coming." And I asked a few of the other businesses, they're not getting mail either. And it had to go through all this to figure all this out. So we're trying to get this mail in. And you're like, well, we're running on fumes here. Like, and it just, it can almost happen for any reason. And so one of the biggest gifts for us was when they finally got to direct deposit on a lot of these things. Yeah. If it didn't show up that day, you were on it because you knew there was like paperwork was mislaid or something, but at least it would move. It tended to move faster. It went into your account faster. And you could also identify it sooner. But, based on like, we had the same experience. The big jobs could kill a business easier than almost anything. And one of the things that we found out, and it's really in a way, like this is where Dryrun came from years down the road, was our experience with some of those issues and some of those big jobs. started doing like all these forecasts and figuring out where everything's coming in and when and all that. And what it did, the biggest difference for our business is it equipped us to go in and negotiate properly. So we would, and I don't know if you ever did this, but we would get to the point where we would land the job and we would go, like, we would basically get to the point of signing the contract, because we knew at that point they didn't want to go back to RFP and stuff. And then we would say, these payment terms are a little tricky for us to deal with. And we would negotiate those payment terms. And it was not, by then we were disciplined enough on deliverables and everything else we had a let down. It was the payment terms that we always did some massive negotiation on to make sure that it worked for us. And we would always have a reason that, it made sense for them too. Realistically, we were making sure that we had that cash flow flowing, because boy, like, yeah, you get a little bit up front and then you're sitting and waiting on their net 30 or net 60, which somehow doesn't, it doesn't quite happen. And you find out it got delayed because somebody was out of town and couldn't sign something. And a company could go down because somebody was on vacation. It's just,
that's very true.
Yeah, but we didn't break an elevator. So that is, but I know the feeling. I know the feeling of having that check in hand and just scraping by and going, yeah, like, we survived this, and onward and upward, right? So you went from, sort of that, sort of like those bigger and bigger jobs. You did sort of slip in there that you had sold this to a big player in your space. How did that all sort of sort out? What were some of your experiences with exiting that business?
Yeah, so I was actually exiting for maybe more so for personal reasons. At the time, I had a very serious health situation I was facing, and I thought this is maybe a good time for me to sell the business and look after that. It was looked after, which is a good thing. So I was pleased about that. But so that was my motivation. Was I just said, what, it's time for me to sell. And it was a long process from the time I said, let's put the, it wasn't like somebody just went and, hey, let's snap this up. So it was a long process. It's kind of like dating. You had to go through a lot of iterations that were not everything you expected before you got to the right one. Yeah. And for us, the right one turned out to be, it was a private equity fund that was backed by a big bank of the US. And so this is where it was fortuitous for me. We closed the deal in 2007, in July of 2007. Of course, in the fall of 2007, the economy went, and then in 2008, the U.S. banks, particularly the regional banks, which this was a regional bank, had some very, very serious issues that they were trying to attend to. So what happened was, over the course of that, the financial health of the U.S. went down. My health went up, and they ended up saying, "Hey, would you stay on and run the company? We know you've sold it, but would you stay on and run it?" And that was the bank. The private equity fund actually went away, and so it was actually the bank itself that asked me if I'd do that, and I said, "Sure." So I had the interesting and very unique experience of becoming an employee in my own company. So I was no longer the owner, right? But I was still the CEO. But now we were a subsidiary of a U.S. public company, of a bank. So that was really interesting. There were some really fun elements to that. Gee, I think I'd like to acquire that competitor. Let's go acquire that competitor, right? You have my favorite quote. I actually met with the CEO of the bank at that time. I think they were about $90 billion in assets. They're well over that now. They're actually, I think, one of the top. They might be number 12 in the U.S. now, under the same CEO. He knows how to grow a company. But I remember meeting with him, and the basic premise was the company I was running was doing some great things, but we needed some capital to go to the next level.
Yep.
So I walked in, met the CEO. He sits down, and he says, "Wally," he says, "before you do your pitch," he says, "I want you to know this." He says, "I have very deep pockets, but very short arms." In other words, there's a huge balance sheet behind them, but he's going to invest it very carefully and with lots of input and checks and balances from other places. So anyway, I just remember that. I remember that quote. So, but it was so in that way, it was fun because I didn't have to worry about where's the cash going to come from, how are you, you know, that was looked after. It was tough though, because that was also out of my control.
Yeah.
And ended up being a big part of why I left, because I said, you know what, I'll see an opportunity and say, well, this is a good bet for us to make, but it was no longer my bet to make. Right. And so I had to, in order to pursue the opportunity I wanted to, I had to leave that. And so I did. I left and started SparcPay. And to address, actually, ironically, what you were just talking about, that, get rid of the checks, let's go to direct deposit. And not only that, with SparcPay, because it does digital approval and payment. So instead of paper checks, you can review and approve payables on your phone. And the next step that we're doing actually really addresses what you're talking about. So we've also got thousands and thousands of vendors that have registered with us and they're receiving direct deposit. So kind of our growing edge right now is how do we help those vendors get more visibility to when is that direct deposit going to hit? Or if it didn't hit, why didn't it hit? And what can you do to fix it? So that's really where we're looking to help them out. Yeah.
So I want to circle back a little bit with like when you started SparcPay. So what was so you left this other business, and did you see that sort of opportunity, like the direct deposit and direct moving of money, kind of when you were exiting that business? Was it part of that business you saw an opportunity, or was it like you left and went, let's take a look, what sort of opportunities out there? Like how did that kind of come around to what kind of flowed into SparcPay?
Yeah, so I sort of made the mistake that you alluded to earlier, which is I left thinking there's got to be a better way. Like just seeing all the paper checks, 400 million commercial checks a year in Canada. It was 500 million then, actually. So just seeing the magnitude of the problem, I said there's got to be a better way, and I left. But I didn't leave with my first sale lined up. Okay, so we were kind of working with the solution and figuring out how to solve it and so on and so forth. But we weren't rolling it out. And again, it was my very best business advisor, my wife, that said to me, why don't you go have a coffee with this friend of ours, who is the CEO of a pretty big company. And I said, that's a good idea. Why don't you just go have a coffee with him? And I went really seeking more advice. But over the course of the coffee and catching up, and he said, so what are you doing right now? He said, well, we've got this thing and it solves a problem and it's going to do it really well, but we got to find our first customer. And he just said, why can't I be your first customer? I went, well, sure. And so that's okay. And then we started getting the traction and then everything happened. But it really was, I almost fell into the trap of building something and assuming that the world is going to be the path to your door. That it doesn't work that way, right? You have to, you have to get out and find that first customer at least, so that you can establish and then grow from there.
And the tricky part, because like my kind of like you, like my first business, kind of like I had sort of deals and opportunities lined up when I started, right? With Dryrun, as an innovation company, I had to have some sort of product, even if it was like absolute ass MVP. I had to have something before I could sell, right? And so it was a different thing. It's like I didn't leave with the customer. I didn't, just like you. I'm like, well, I don't have that because I don't have a product yet. And kind of like you, like I did, 40, 50 cups of coffee and how many liters of beer going through before you talking with business owners and going, I think there's an opportunity here, but I still have to go and have something. It can't just be an idea, right? And then validate it. And so it was the first customer is the biggest one. And like, we were really low cost at that point. It was ridiculously inexpensive. And it was like barely above manual. And it was, like such a prototype. I always say it's duct tape and chicken wire was holding it together, but got my first 3, 4, 5 customers and then went, yeah, we're onto something here. And then it's almost like the painful for us, it was on for what we're building. We kind of went, well, now we have to build it. Like we can't renovate what we have there. That validated it. Now we actually have to build this thing, right? So then we built it, and then we rolled it out, and then it's almost like, getting that first customer for the real thing. What was amazing was some of the customers from our duct tape prototype hung on, came over to the actual product, which was really kind of neat. But it is a boy, coming from a different industry that where I had sort of cash coming in the door, and you could go out and sell, and you could get a big deal, and you could get that cash, to be able to go to something where you're building, all the belief in the world, but you're building something and have to put a lot of time, money, energy out before you can get the engine going was a really hard learning experience, and a really big challenge. And you see now why 90% of innovation companies are gone within their first 5 years. Like half of businesses are gone within their first 5 years, but these like innovation companies, it's like, I didn't know that when I started. And like, whoo, snuck through that one, right? It's a real challenge. It's a different world.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You're absolutely right. Because if you're innovating, you have to, in a way, you have to build it before you can sell it, right? And so you're not the old model, which I think you and I both had some experience with that old model, where you could get some money up front and then, sort of prime the pump and go. Well, now you really have to build it first. Maybe it's with duct tape, but you have to build something that'll at least that you can deliver, right? And then grow from there. But the thing is, with innovation, as you say, well, you build it and then you kind of have to rebuild it. And is somebody else going to build something? I'd say the thing about innovation is it's not you're not working in a static environment, right? Other things around you are going to change, and you have to be prepared to pivot and adapt. And I think, I mean, it's just my impression, but I think probably a big part of that 90%, it was probably a good idea to start out with, and it worked, but something changed, and they failed to pivot.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I agree with you. But the idea is about the people outside of entrepreneurship think the idea is everything. There's so much value to an idea, and the idea is basically worthless. Like any idea that's come up with, there's probably 20,000 entrepreneurs across the planet have thought of the same thing in the same week, kind of thing. But it starts going down to the nuance of the idea, the real problem solving, that you're doing this a little bit unique, that really addresses an issue. And then it just comes down to execution. And that's, when you watching the Silicon Valley shows and all the, like, there's reality, or there's truth to that. But so much of it actually, for successful business in the innovation space, goes down to some really solid fundamentals of execution, and finding those roots and making those pivots. Like we've done that, and we've had some real success with it. But recognizing it, being disciplined, and doing that pivot and executing that properly. And you have no margin for error. Like, you so little margin for error, right? And then there's the issue of, like, actually, it's interesting because you sort of mentioned it a little bit before, or alluded to it a bit before. Timing is such a critical thing. And it's the one thing that's pretty hard to, you can't really like predict that or pick the timing. But sometimes the timing just ends up in your favor, and sometimes you're a little too early or a little too late, and you can't do anything about it. And it's one of the harsh realities is you can get upset by the timing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And timing is typically not within your control, right? So it's the old adage, what I can't control what happens to me, but I can control how I respond or react to it, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's what it's all about, whether it's bad timing or whether it's an industry change or something else, losing a key employee, whatever. Any setback in the business, those are all going to happen. And then it's a question of how do you react to it, and can you react in such a way that you can keep moving forward?
Yeah, exactly. And I was trying to think of what you had mentioned that had sprung that into my head. And it was actually when you sold your business, and it was 2007 when it closed, and not much later, 2000, late seven, 2008, 2009, everything's kind of upended and it changed so much. Right. But the other side of it is, let's say that it hit and you couldn't sell right then. There's something like, even what we're experiencing now with open close with COVID and everything. There is often opportunity in there, and I think you alluded to it, is that if you can identify an opportunity and you pivot, and you pivot fast, you find that opportunity and pivot fast. You may have had just as good of an outcome had that happened, if you could have found that route through that pivot, that market that wasn't there before, that is suddenly there.
That's right. I mean, you don't know what would have happened, but there's no question, like the sale that we closed in 2007, we would not have been able to close that sale in 2008. It just wouldn't have happened, right? Nobody knew what was coming, but by the time it hit, it changed the world. Similarly with this, I mean, I had a fleeting, very, very fleeting thought as I left Creditron, and before I had started SparcPay, I took some time off, which is a dangerous thing for me to do. And I was driving, there's a beautiful old building in a small town near here, and it came up for sale. And I said to my wife, I said, you know what? We could buy that and convert it to a restaurant. And given what's happened to the restaurant industry during COVID, I'm very pleased that we decided not to go ahead with that fleeting thought. But it's just one of those things where you don't know what nobody knows what tomorrow's going to bring, right? So all you can do is, as you say, I mean, you do everything you can to execute, you do everything you can to plan, and then you prepare that you may need to pivot. That you just have to be, the best played plans are there to change, but you still have to have it in place. You know all your options, but then you just start adapting on the fly. So you're being proactive, but you also have to be very reactive as the stuff comes in the door, right? I mean, there are these black swans that nobody can foresee, and that can cause you a problem. But there are lots of things that you can foresee if you're looking. Which is what your business is about helping people to see what really is in front. It's not a, gee, this may or may not happen. It's something completely out of the blue. It's things that are quite likely to happen, but if you don't line them up and model it, you might be unprepared for something that was, quite frankly, a likelihood, right? And very predictable too. And exactly. And it's not just being able to predict it. That's the thing where I see there's, if you're not sort of looking into the future, not predicting and not modeling these things out, and not keeping track of your finances and everything, not only can you you can get hit with something that is a surprise to you, but it shouldn't have been a surprise because you could see it there. But when you see it ahead of time, that's almost like that's where those pivots can come from. If you can identify an issue far enough out, you have options. Now you're starting to, what you're modeling out is, what are the different options? So you're going from identifying a potential, let's say a shortfall, to not only how do we deal with it, like what are different options? What's the best way to deal with it, rather than just having it come and, surprise you and slap you in the face, right? So I wanted to dive in a little bit on SparcPay and get like, you've talked about helping vendors and helping businesses. Tell me a little bit more, and everyone listening, because again, this this is a problem that everyone in business has, is getting that money flowing and getting it moving back and forth. Tell me a little bit more about like what you do, how you engage people, what sort of businesses are can really benefit from what you're doing, and like where you're at. Sure. So really, when it comes to payments, the very, very biggest corporations have solved it with electronic means, which is great. The very smallest ones can use, effectively consumer tools like Interac or a credit card to deal with it. But there's a huge swath through the middle that, frankly, right now is still relying on paper, because that's the way it works, right? So let's say the owner of a business that might not go in every day. So there's a bookkeeper that, enters the bills, and then a controller that prepares the checks, and then the controller delivers the checks to the owner, who then signs them, and then it goes all the way back, and so forth, right? Yeah. Or, you know, it's an association with a volunteer board. So the volunteers who, you know, now everybody's working from their home, but they're working from their home on a volunteer basis, but they have to sign checks, they have to authorize payments. So what do? Well, it's really the wrong thing to do is, well, I'll sign some blank checks and, you know, while I see them, and let them figure it out, right? Yeah. Wrong way to do it. The right way to do it, in our opinion, is to find a way to get rid of the paperwork, get rid of the data entry, get rid of the reconciliation, you know, with your suppliers. Provide something that's, you know, digital, that's real time, accessible on your mobile phone, and that synchronizes with your suppliers so that they have some visibility as well, right? And that's really what SparcPay does. It gets so it's an end-to-end digital solution. It's web-based. It's mobile-friendly. It still has all the same control points, the opportunity to review, to approve. It actually has more control because it's going to have a better audit trail and better visibility. Yeah. And but it gets rid of the paperwork, minimizes the data entry, gets rid of the reconciliation, and now things just flow through digitally rather than by paper. So that's really what SparcPay is about. It's one of those things, and this is one of the things I love about it. It's a win-win. It's a win for the organization that's doing the paying, because they're more efficient now and can do a better job and save money. But it's also a win for the vendors, because they're going to get paid faster and have more visibility. So it's not a win-lose proposition. It's a win-win, and that's what I really like about it.
Yeah, and that's why you're growing so fast and doing so well. And it's you know, I guess we've come up on our time here, but I really, this is a great conversation, Wally. It was a lot of fun hearing, you know, about your background, because I was more, you know, in the know about the SparcPay side and where you are now. So I really enjoyed hearing about that and how, you know, that moved you through to this innovation. If people are looking to get find you, get hold of you, you know, find out about SparcPay, where should they go to do that?
Yeah, so our website, sparkpay.com, that's SPARCPAY.com. So Spark with a C, sparkpay.com. You can go in there. You can read about us. Our pricing is there. We're very transparent, and you can also request a demo or a phone call from there. We're also in the QuickBooks Online App Store. So if you're a QuickBooks Online user, you can find us through the App Store as well.
Yeah, terrific. Well, thanks so much, Wally. I really enjoyed our conversation. And for any of you out there, again, I'm co-founder and CEO at Dryrun. If you're looking for a way to manage your cash flow, do some financial modeling, plan for the future, especially if you're a CFO or a CPA that's advising management and your clients on their finances, please come check us out at Dryrun. We would love to talk with you and see if we might be a fit for you. Thanks again, Wally. This was a terrific conversation. I really enjoyed catching up and hearing some great stories.
Thanks very much, Blaine. It was fantastic to catch up.